Hi, I'm Veronica Nye, Chief Economist at the Fertilizer Institute. The last time that we were together, we were talking about the Strait of Hormuz closure and its impact on fertilizer markets. And I said that I hope the next time we're together, we wouldn't be talking about that topic, but unfortunately, we are, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I wanted to go through a little bit from a supply and demand standpoint, talk about timing, what we're seeing in the fertilizer market today, because I think charts can be really helpful to understand the impacts and visualize what the market is kind of going through right now. So, as a reminder, the countries that are impacted by the conflict and the Strait of Hormuz closure, they represent, according to the International Fertilizer Institute, about 50% of global urea exports, about 20 to 25% of global ammonia exports, 20 to 25% of global phosphate exports, and nearly 50% of global sulfur exports. So, and this is exports to the whole world. So what we're dealing with today is a lot of consumers of fertilizer around the world who are now incredibly concerned about where their fertilizer supplies are going to come from without any certainty about when the strait is going to reopen. Now, as the conflict continues, the complications also continue. So prior to the last few days and this week, we were really looking at kind of just a transportation issue. Not that that wasn't significant, but a transportation issue. How do we get vessels through the Strait of Hormuz once it reopens? Now we're starting to look at challenges related to, of course, getting those full vessels through the Strait of Hormuz once it reopens, but also how we get, of course, those empty vessels through to fill them from the production that those fertilizer facilities have been producing during the conflict. But now even more complicated is the fact that up until now, most of those fertilizer facilities have been producing product, but they're now running out of storage capacity. And if the conflict lasts much longer, they will be forced to shut down production because they don't have storage capacity any longer. And our facilities, whether they be in the US, whether they be in the impacted region or anywhere else in the world, our facilities are relatively easy to shut down, but not all that easy to start back up. It's a couple of week process to restart a chemical fertilizer production plant. So that significantly lengthens the amount of time once the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, where we can start looking at that exportable supply being available to the global marketplace. And then, as if that wasn't enough, there's certainly been damage from engagement in the conflict between Iran and Israel to some of the natural gas fields in Iran and potentially production facilities of fertilizer, which could certainly be a long-term consequence to fertilizer capacity, which the full impact of that won't be known until, of course, the end of the conflict. So that's a lot on the supply side directly from the conflict. There are knock-on effects, of course, of that as well. From the natural gas side, Qatar is a large exporter of natural gas. We're seeing that those gas flows are leading to other countries who are large producers of nitrogen fertilizer starting to reduce their production of fertilizer. Think India and Bangladesh, which are large consumers of nitrogen fertilizers. But now we're also starting to see countries like Algeria, which is also a large producer of urea and a large exporter of natural gas, who just announced today that they were going to curtail their urea production by 50%, and speculation that is in order to prioritize exports of LNG. So let's look at the demand side a little bit. Of course, in the United States, we're in the middle of spring plant. And when we're looking at, from a demand side, expectations on demand were really built around that February acreage estimate, and estimates, around application rates and share of acres treated with fertilizer previous to the Strait of Hormuz closure. So that's kind of what the market was thinking about. That's what the world on a demand perspective was looking at, the US and everybody else. So now though, the US is in spring plant, the other countries in the Northern Hemisphere are in spring plant or about to be, and now there's a lot of questions about what will growers in the US do, what will growers in other parts of the world do, and how will that impact total fertilizer demand. So I'll turn to the chart now. And I hope this isn't triggering to anyone from a background standpoint. I hope you had very good experiences in your economics class. I'm sure you did, especially if you had an ag econ class. But so here's our previous expectation of global fertilizer demand, again, prior to the Strait of Hormuz closure. This is a global demand. And then, of course, we're looking at global supply of fertilizer. And then we have a price point with a quantity here and a price here. We'll put ones behind all this. And so today, as we're thinking about the Strait of Hormuz closure, that is clearly a reduction in the short term of global supply of fertilizer. Now, while those countries are certainly significant exporters of product, there are other exporters and producers of fertilizers in the world. They are not at this particular juncture large enough or productive enough to make up for that lost capacity. The other large exporters that we're thinking about, particularly in the urea space, are Russia, Algeria, Nigeria, Malaysia. That sort of rounds out the top 10. Now, on the long-term perspective, of course, you can add capacity. The United States has a lot of production of nitrogen fertilizer, and if the policy and investment conditions are correct, of course, we could add a lot of additional production capacity here in the United States, and that's certainly a conversation that it deserves to be had. But looking at this strictly from a short-term perspective, this is what the trading environment is dealing with today. So you had this adjustment that we're working with today. Now you may have some movement back here a little bit as those other producers and exporters might be able to make some adjustment, but more or less for simplicity, let's talk about that supply curve sort of shifting to the left. Now on a demand perspective, there's limited ability oftentimes for growers to be able to change their planting mix. They've oftentimes bought seed, they've bought their inputs, they've made their financing decisions. So there is some ability to change crop mix, but that's oftentimes a bit more fixed than one might expect. And so by and large, we're at this point, at least from a US perspective, working on this off of this demand curve. Yes, there will be some trade-off, and that's a huge question now. Or what change in application rates are we expecting? Will we expect some acres to just not be planted? What switch from maybe from corn to soybeans might occur? So of course you might see some change in demand. You might see some reduction to here. You might see some smaller version of that. You may see no change in that, but that is what the global supply chain in the fertilizer sector is dealing with currently, and trying to figure out how long does the Strait of Hormuz closure last? How long do these conditions last in the short term? So obviously a lot of volatility in the fertilizer market. That's why it's been being discussed, of course, in the agricultural space, because this is a key element to growing and producing food, but also outside of the agricultural space, as the rest of the world has become aware that It's not just oil and natural gas that is a key export out of this out of the impacted region, but also fertilizer products. So I know that was long, but I hope it was helpful, and hopefully, you know, again, this is a short run type of discussion, but in the long term, we can talk about changes in supply, we can talk about additional adds in capacity, and we can talk about adjustments in demand. But today, as the world is dealing with the Strait of Hormuz closure, we're certainly dealing with a shock to global supply of fertilizer, and trying to make adjustments. The market is trying to make some adjustments to figure out where the available supplies go, and at what price conditions does that look like. So thanks very much for joining me. Again, I hope the next time that we're together, this is not the topic of conversation. Thanks so much.